Hey, once again, we're doing our Finance in Focus discussion that we have. This week it is what has been a bit of a topic of discussion was I announced when we were having an ERS function at the end of last week, I announced the amount of tax that ERS will be collecting. And that created a whole lot of discussions around, with us tax going up to about 16.5 billion, isn't that enough to be able to fund the budget? And why do we need to loan money if we do have so much tax that's being collected? And so maybe just expand on this and help the man on the streets, really just understand, what happens around these things. And so to explain, so what we do have is, where does our money come from? First of all, we do collect. In fact, we are planning to collect this year about 16.5 billion. Last year was 14.5 billion, so we've lifted the bar quite high for ERS to try and collect the 16.5, but we feel that it should be attainable. Keeping in mind we haven't lifted any taxes, but just hoping that they can broaden the taxpayers, because we still have taxpayers that are outside the tax net, which we're trying to bring in and trying to put some mechanisms in place to really try and make sure people are honest with their taxes and paying the right amount of taxes. And so what we then have is, what we must understand is, even though we are collecting 16.5, our expenditure for the year as a country is about 32 billion. 32.3, but our expenditure is about 32. So let's just call it almost double the amount of our tax is really what our expenditure is. Then one says, well, how do we close the difference? And so we then collect another 1 billion, more or less, of tax that is not collected by ERS. So it's about 1 billion more that is collected in what we call non-direct tax. So it might be stuff like collections at the border, vehicle payments, license payments, those kind of things. Are being collected outside of ERS. So there's about 1 billion emalangeni we collect there. Then we get about 11.5 billion emalangeni from SACU. So at the moment, like I've always said, a large portion of our expenditure is from our SACU arrangement that we have with the different countries, and that really goes a long way in our budget. So another 11.5 billion comes from there, leaving about 3 billion emalangeni, which means we then have about 29 billion, but our expenditure is 32. So we then loan about another 3 billion emalangeni to close that gap and to take us to 32 billion. Now, the reason why we can loan more money in the year is because, keeping in mind, we try to keep our debt to GDP ratio the same. So which means the fact that our GDP is now growing as a country is really helping us be able to actually take a bit more debt on board. So we try and stay about the 40 to 41% debt to GDP ratio, meaning that the affordability of repaying the debt remains the same as what it is. But the nice thing is, now with our GDP growing, as you know, this year we're even projecting a 7.9% GDP growth, and even if it isn't that high, but it's still around the 5s or 6%, it is still very high for the region. So we're really having a very decent GDP growth at the moment, and that's meaning that we can now take on a bit more debt, because it means that our debt to GDP ratio remains about the same if we take on about 3 billion emalangeni's debt. And so that more or less explains where the money comes from for our budget. Again, now you'd say, where does so much money get spent on? It doesn't feel like in a country like we're spending 32 billion. But what we must keep in mind, and that is first of all the wage bill. In fact, let me start off by saying we have the recurrent expenditure and we have the capital expenditure. So recurrent expenditure, what that means, it just means the money that we spend on goods and services, which means that it is money that has got nothing to show for it when it's spent, except the fact that someone's worked hard, or someone's been taught, or someone's delivered a service to you. But it's not like brick and mortar. It's not things that actually have a building or a car or something like left behind. So the capital things is something where there's brick and mortar and something that's actually tangible, and the recurrent is something that's not tangible, but it is education or it is a service that's been delivered to you by the government. So at the moment, about 25 billion emalangeni is spent on recurrent, and about 7.3 billion is spent on capital expenditure. So now that recurrent expenditure, of that, about 10 billion is wages, and then about 15 billion is the rest of things outside of wages. And the rest of things being keeping cars on the road, being able to do it, be able to fund our state-owned entities. So a lot of our state-owned entities still need a subvention to be able to continue doing what they're doing for the country. ERS, for instance, we have to use money to pay ERS to do these collections for us. They're the biggest one, but other than them, there's a long list of subvented entities that we pay money to. We need to be able to pay interest. Interest is a big one. So of all the debt that we have, at the moment we have about a 36 billion emalangeni debt. the interest on the debt, because I always say, we must keep in mind, Maswati, that the problem with debt is not actually repaying the capital portion of the debt, it's repaying the interest. It's the interest that always, in a sense, hurts almost the most with having to repay debt and actually taking debt on in the first place. And so this year we're paying about 2.7 billion emalangeni just on interest that we have with our loans that are currently out there. But again, we fund the cars that we drive and things like that in government with that balance. And so that's the reason, that's where the money goes. What we